In 1975, two men sat in a parked car outside Wollaston Beach in Quincy, Massachusetts. One was a violent criminal who'd already killed multiple people. The other was an FBI agent. They weren't there for an arrest, they were making a deal. The criminal would provide information, and in exchange, the FBI would protect him from prosecution, warn him about investigations, and help him eliminate his rivals. Over the next 20 years, this partnership would result in 19 murders, millions in drug money, and the complete corruption of the FBI's Boston office. The criminal's name was James "Whitey" Bulger, and what he did to the FBI would become the greatest scandal in the Bureau's history. But here's the thing nobody wants to admit: Bulger didn't corrupt the FBI. The FBI corrupted itself, and Bulger just took advantage. James Joseph Bulger, Jr. was born on September 3, 1929, in the midst of America's Great Depression. His world began not in the glamorous criminal underworld you might imagine, but in poverty so crushing it would shape everything that came after. His father, James Joseph Bulger, Sr., came from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, the son of Irish parents. After settling in Everett, Massachusetts, he married Jane Veronica Jean McCarthy, a first-generation Irish immigrant. They were working people, honest people, trying to make their way in a country that didn't always welcome the Irish with open arms. Bulger's father worked as a union laborer and occasional longshoreman. The family fell into poverty after he lost his arm in an industrial accident. Imagine being a child and watching your father, your protector, your provider, suddenly unable to work, unable to put food on the table. The Bulgers weren't just poor, they were desperate. And in 1938, when Jimmy was just 9 years old, salvation seemed to arrive in the form of public housing. In May 1938, the Mary Ellen McCormack Housing Project was opened in the neighborhood of South Boston, an insular, working-class Irish-American neighborhood. The Bulger family moved into the housing project and the children grew up there. This wasn't just any neighborhood. South Boston, or Southie as locals called it, was a world unto itself. It had its own rules, its own code, its own way of handling problems. The police were outsiders, the government was the enemy, and loyalty to your neighborhood, your people, your tribe, that was everything. South Boston in the 1930s and 1940s was an insular, violence-prone environment where community loyalty outweighed respect for law and authority. Bulger's immersion in this culture laid the foundation for a life defined by criminal deviance. Exposure to street crime and a lack of moral guidance, compounded by economic despair, cultivated antisocial tendencies and normalized violence as a means to power. The housing project where the Bulgers lived would become famous for all the wrong reasons, but it also produced some remarkable figures. Just a few doors down lived another family that would become central to Boston's history. Other residents included future U.S. Representative Joseph Moakley and Francis "Buddy" Leonard, who would later be allegedly murdered by Bulger in 1975 during his violent takeover of Boston's underworld. But most importantly for our story, this is where John Connolly grew up. Connolly admired his neighbor William "Billy" Bulger, 6 years his senior. He did not meet Billy's older brother, James "Whitey" Bulger, until he was 8 years old. Think about that for a moment: two kids from the same projects, breathing the same air, walking the same streets. One would become an FBI agent, the other would become America's most notorious crime boss. And somehow, impossibly, they would become partners. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what kind of child James Bulger was, while his younger siblings, William Bulger and John P. Bulger excelled at school. James Bulger, Jr., was drawn into street life. Early in his criminal career, local police gave Bulger the nickname Whitey because of his blonde hair. He hated that nickname, by the way. Absolutely despised it. To his face, people called him Jimmy. Only behind his back or in police reports was he Whitey. By age 10, Bulger was already drawing police attention. Arrested at 14 for theft, his rap sheet quickly expanded to include assault, forgery, and armed robbery. Known to police by the nickname Whitey due to his light blonde hair, a name he despised, he spent 5 years in a juvenile reformatory, where he learned advanced criminal methods and hardened his anti-authority mindset. The reformatory was supposed to reform him, to set him straight. Instead, it became his university of crime. His time in juvenile detention offered little deterrence. Instead, it confirmed what would become a lifelong belief: that he could exploit legal systems and avoid serious consequences through charm, manipulation, and, when necessary, violence. There's a story that captures the young Whitey Bulger perfectly. Whitey talked about when he was 16 years old, he was in the back of a precinct house in South Boston, and he said a police officer jammed a gun in his mouth, and the police officer was leaning so close to him he could smell the liquor on his breath. Even at that tender age of 16, Whitey was clearly in the fast life, in the criminal life, and that sort of began that confrontational attitude he had with authority right there. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. This was something darker, something more calculated. While his brother Billy was studying law and politics, Jimmy was studying violence. While Billy was learning how to work within the system, Jimmy was learning how to destroy it. After his time in the reformatory, Bulger briefly tried to go straight. In 1948, he enrolled in the U.S. Air Force and was given an honorable discharge in 1952. But even the military couldn't contain him. He served time in military jail for assault before being arrested for going AWOL. Nonetheless, he received an honorable discharge in 1952. When he returned to Boston, Bulger was done pretending to be anything other than what he was, a criminal. After returning to Boston, Bulger embarked upon a life of crime. His offenses grew increasingly large in scale, culminating in a string of bank robberies from Rhode Island to Indiana. In June 1956, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He ended up serving 9 years, including stints in Atlanta, Alcatraz, and Leavenworth. Alcatraz, the Rock, the most infamous prison in America. For most criminals, it would be the end of the story. For Whitey Bulger, it was just the beginning, because something happened to him in those federal prisons, something that would later become one of the most controversial chapters of his life. There, he volunteered to be a test subject in various experiments with the hallucinogenic drug LSD. The CIA was running a program called MK Ultra, experimenting on prisoners with mind-altering drugs, trying to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation. Bulger claimed these experiments damaged him, changed him, made him more violent. Whether that's true or just another manipulation, we'll never know. But when he emerged from federal prison in 1965, he was a different man. Harder, smarter, and absolutely ruthless. Although sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, he was granted parole in 1965 following stints at such notorious penitentiaries as Leavenworth and Alcatraz. He returned to a Boston that was changing. The old Irish gangs were at war, the Italian Mafia was growing stronger, and the FBI was desperately trying to understand and infiltrate this complex web of organized crime. Upon his return to Boston, Bulger became an enforcer for mob kingpin Donald Killeen, and in the early 1970s he took on similar duties with the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American crime syndicate led by Howie Winter. The Killeen Gang controlled South Boston, running the loan sharking, the gambling, the truck hijacking. Bulger was good at violence, very good, and Donald Killeen recognized that talent immediately. But the streets of Boston were about to explode in a gang war that would change everything. In 1971, Kenny Killeen, the youngest of the Killeen brothers, allegedly shot and mauled Michael "Mickey" Dwyer, a member of the rival Mullen Gang, during a brawl at the Transit Cafe. A gang war resulted, leading to a string of killings throughout Boston and the surrounding suburbs. The Killeens quickly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by the younger Mullens. This is when Whitey Bulger revealed his true nature. Not just as a killer, but as a strategist, a manipulator, someone who understood that in the underworld, loyalty was a luxury you couldn't afford. Bulger, realizing he was on the losing side, is alleged to have secretly approached Howie Winter, the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, and claimed he could end the war by murdering the Killeen leadership. Shortly thereafter, on May 13, 1972, Donald Killeen was gunned down outside his home in Framingham, Massachusetts. His own enforcer had sold him out. Bulger had switched sides at exactly the right moment, proving he would do anything, betray anyone, to survive and thrive. The peace meeting that followed was held at Chandler's nightclub in Boston's South End. In a sit-down at Chandler's nightclub in Boston's South End, the Mullens were represented by Nee and King, and the Killeens by Bulger. Picture this scene: sworn enemies sitting across from each other, guns hidden but present, everyone knowing that the wrong word could start a bloodbath. And there's Whitey Bulger, representing a gang whose leader he had likely just helped murder, negotiating for his own future. The Mullens and Killeens agreed to cease hostilities and consolidate under the leadership of Winter. The Winter Hill Gang was born from this merger, and Whitey Bulger had maneuvered himself into a position of power. He hadn't just survived the gang war, he had profited from it. This was 1972, and Bulger was now a key figure in the Winter Hill Gang, but the FBI was watching. They had been trying to crack organized crime in Boston for years, with limited success. The Italian Mafia, particularly the Patriarca crime family, seemed untouchable. The Irish gangs were violent and unpredictable, and then someone had an idea that would change everything. What if instead of fighting these criminals, they could use them? In 1971, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, approached Bulger and attempted to recruit him as an informant in an ongoing effort to gain information on the Patriarca crime family. FBI Special Agent John Connolly, who like Bulger had grown up in South Boston, was assigned to make the pitch. Remember John Connolly, the kid from the projects who idolized the Bulger brothers? He was FBI now, ambitious, eager to make his mark. Ironically, Condon, who was Connolly's FBI supervisor, had approached Whitey Bulger in the early 1970s, with little result. Because of their neighborhood ties, Connolly would prove to have the inside track with Bulger that Condon did not, but Bulger initially refused. The idea of being a rat, that was the worst thing you could be in Southie. It went against everything the neighborhood stood for, but Connolly was persistent, and more importantly, he understood Bulger's psychology. This wasn't about being an informant, Connolly argued. This was about using the FBI to eliminate your enemies. In 1975, Bulger agreed to work with the FBI as a so-called top echelon informant. His FBI handler was another son of South Boston, John J. Connolly, who was about 10 years younger than Bulger and who had grown up idolizing him along with Bulger's brother, William, who became a powerful Massachusetts politician. The informant relationship quickly turned corrupt, becoming what was later described as a devil's deal and giving rise to the worst informant scandal in FBI history. Think about what this meant. The FBI, America's premier law enforcement agency, was now in business with a killer. Not just any killer, but one of the most violent criminals in Boston, and they justified it by saying he would help them against the Italian Mafia. Connolly represented the FBI's obsession with Italian-American crime families, and Bulger fed a steady stream of information on the Patriarca crime family based in nearby Providence, Rhode Island. But here's what the FBI didn't understand, or chose not to understand. Whitey Bulger wasn't really giving them intelligence on the Mafia. He was using them to eliminate his competition. In reality, however, Bulger and Flemmy were far less valuable as informants than their handlers purported them to be. In a 2011 interview, Flemmy recalled, "Me and Whitey gave the feds shit, and they gave us gold." The relationship was corrupt from the very beginning. In addition to protecting the Winter Hill Gang from prosecution, Connolly and Morris accepted bribes from Bulger and Flemmy during their frequent meetings. We're not talking about small amounts either. According to the Boston Globe, Bulger and Flemmy gave Connolly $235,000 over 2 decades, but money was just part of it. Bulger also lavished John Morris, Connolly's supervisor and the head of the FBI's organized crime squad in Boston, with airline tickets and cases of expensive wine. These weren't bribes in Connolly's mind, they were gifts between friends. That's how deep the corruption went. The lines between cop and criminal had been completely erased. FBI supervisor John Morris was put in charge of the organized crime squad at the FBI's Boston field office in December 1977. Morris not only proved himself unable to rein in Connolly's protection of Bulger, he even began assisting him. Under pressure from superiors to cultivate informants who could be used against the Mafia, Connolly and Morris portrayed Bulger and Flemmy as invaluable sources in order to advance their careers. Stephen Flemmy, we need to talk about him. Bulger also worked closely with another FBI informer named Stephen Flemmy, also in the Winter Hill Gang, who had first been recruited by the Bureau in 1965. Flemmy was already an informant when Bulger joined the FBI's roster. Together, they formed a deadly partnership, both in crime and in their manipulation of the FBI. The year 1979 was pivotal. Bulger managed to avoid being named in an indictment for fixing horse races at tracks up and down the East Coast, a case that eventually led to the conviction of Winter and several of his associates. The resulting power vacuum allowed Bulger to assume leadership of the Winter Hill Gang. How did Bulger avoid those charges? Bulger and Flemmy were originally going to be part of this indictment, but Connolly and Morris were able to persuade prosecutor Jeremiah T. O'Sullivan to drop the charges against them at the last minute. Bulger and Flemmy were instead named as unindicted co-conspirators. This wasn't just protection, this was active intervention by the FBI to keep their informants on the street. While Winter went to prison, Bulger took over the entire organization. In 1979, the boss and deputy of the Winter Hill Gang, as it became known, were arrested for fixing horse races, and Bulger took over the gang's leadership. Now in charge, Bulger transformed the Winter Hill Gang into something more sophisticated and more violent, establishing a racket by which he extorted money from bookmakers, loan sharks, drug dealers, and other local criminals. Bulger soon acquired a fearsome reputation both within and beyond the illicit underworld. The murders started piling up. Let me tell you about just a few, because each one shows how Bulger operated with complete immunity. A shrewd, ruthless, cunning mobster, Bulger sanctioned numerous killings, including the murders of Spike O'Toole, Polly McGonigal, Eddie Connors, Tommy King, and Buddy Leonard. Take the case of Roger Wheeler. In May 1981, Roger Wheeler, the owner of World Jai-Alai, a gambling enterprise from which Bulger and Flemmi had been skimming money, was shot between the eyes in the parking lot of his country club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The killer was Winter Hill Gang hitman John Martorano. Wheeler was a legitimate businessman who had discovered Bulger's people were skimming from his company, so Bulger had him killed hundreds of miles from Boston, thinking the distance would provide cover. But someone knew about the Wheeler murder, Brian Halloran, and Halloran made a fatal mistake. He tried to trade that information to the FBI for protection. Halloran feared for his life, so he went to the FBI to exchange information for protection. However, once Connolly heard about Halloran's confession, he arranged it so that Bulger would not be arrested and that Halloran's testimony would be deemed untrustworthy. Halloran was subsequently turned away from an FBI safe house, and on May 11, 1982, Halloran was murdered as he left a bar in South Boston. The FBI didn't just fail to protect Halloran, they signed his death warrant. Acting on a tip from the FBI agent, Bulger lured suspected informers to a house in South Boston, chained them to a chair for interrogation, shot them in the head, and buried them in the basement. There was also the murder of John Callahan. On August 1, Martorano lured Callahan into a car and shot him in the head during a meeting at Fort Lauderdale International Airport. With the assistance of Joe McDonald, Martorano left the body in the trunk of Callahan's leased Cadillac in a garage at Miami International Airport. The body was discovered on August 3 when a parking attendant noticed blood dripping from the trunk of the car. The bodies kept piling up. The jury has found that Bulger played a role in the murders of Deborah Hussey, Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Arthur Barrett, and John McIntyre. Each murder made Bulger more powerful, more feared, and each time the FBI protected him. Over time, Bulger's corrupt relationship with his FBI contact, Connolly, and the FBI office deepened. Connolly frequently alerted Bulger to other authorities' investigations into the Winter Hill Gang's operations and cast a blind eye even to the murders that the organization perpetrated. But Bulger wasn't just killing his enemies. He was building an empire. In the early 1980s, Bulger continued to operate the Boston rackets with impunity while he accumulated more experience with murder, including the killing of a completely innocent man who happened to be giving a lift home to one of Bulger's targets. That innocent man was Michael Donahue, who just happened to be giving Brian Halloran a ride home when Bulger's hit team struck. The drug trade was particularly lucrative. In the 1980s, Bulger started shaking down narcotics distributors and supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army, which was fighting the British government in Northern Ireland. According to biographers, Bulger kept a sort of code around his involvement in narcotics, refusing to allow heroin to come into South Boston, for example. This was one of Bulger's great lies, that he kept drugs out of Southie. The biggest myth is that he kept drugs out of South Boston. If you look back and you go through the studies, there was just as much drug abuse and just as much drugs flowing around South Boston, if not more, than other neighborhoods. So the idea that Whitey kept drugs out of South Boston is a joke and a myth, and is just the opposite. He actually took millions and millions of dollars in tribute and extorted money from drug dealers in South Boston. The only ones he chased out of South Boston were the ones who wouldn't pay him. Meanwhile, his brother William was rising through legitimate channels. In 1978, William Bulger becomes president of the state senate and goes on to serve in the post longer than anyone in its history. One brother was the most powerful politician in Massachusetts. The other was the most powerful criminal, and somehow nobody in law enforcement seemed to think this was a problem worth investigating. The situation was so absurd that other law enforcement agencies began to notice something was wrong. By January 1980, the FBI were aware of Bulger's headquarters at the garage, but failed to investigate or inform other law enforcement agencies of the Winter Hill Gang's presence there. The Massachusetts State Police, MSP, discovered the location by chance while investigating an auto theft ring, finding that Bulger and Flemmi would openly associate with other organized crime figures, including Donato, Danny, Angulo, Vincent the Animal, Ferrara, and Ilario, Larry Zanino, at the garage. The Massachusetts State Police made this discovery by accident. The FBI knew where Bulger was operating from and did nothing. Worse than nothing, they actively protected him from investigation. In 1988, something happened that would begin Bulger's long downfall. In 1988, Bulger's status as an FBI informant was revealed publicly when the Globe's Spotlight team, led by journalist Gerard O'Neill, published a series of articles detailing the numerous crimes committed and attributed to Bulger while nominally under the protection of the Bureau. The city of Boston was stunned. Whitey Bulger, the untouchable crime boss, was a rat. It seemed impossible. In the code of the streets, especially in Southie, there was nothing worse than being an informant, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bulger may have convinced himself he wasn't an informer, but many in the underworld saw it differently, apparently including the men who killed him. According to some news reports, the attackers gouged out Bulger's eyes and attempted to cut out his tongue, a retribution often delivered by mob killers to suspected rats. Even decades later, the revelation that he was an informant would seal his fate. But in 1988, Bulger was still protected, still powerful. The FBI closed ranks, denied everything they could, and kept their prized informant on the streets. It would take another 6 years before the House of Cards finally collapsed. In 1991, Bulger muscled himself into a share of a $14 million winning lottery ticket from the legal lotto, a ticket that was sold in a store he controlled. This wasn't just greed, it was hubris. Bulger thought he was untouchable. He was extorting legitimate lottery winners, murdering with impunity, running drugs while claiming to keep them out of his neighborhood. By the early 1990s, other law enforcement agencies had had enough. By the early 1990s, the compromised integrity of the FBI with respect to Bulger had become apparent to local and state police, who, along with the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, then launched a new investigation. The DEA, the Massachusetts State Police, and even honest FBI agents from outside Boston began building a case. They worked in secret, knowing that Boston's FBI office was compromised. In the early 1990s, the DEA, MSP, and U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston launched a multi-agency task force to pursue a RICO indictment against Bulger and his inner circle. Working independently from the FBI, they accumulated enough evidence to bring down the Winter Hill Gang once and for all. And then, on December 23, 1994, the call came. On December 23, 1994, Bulger went into hiding after his former FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about a pending RICO indictment against him. On December 23, 1994, John Connolly, by then retired, warned Bulger of imminent federal charges. Hours later, Bulger disappeared. One phone call, that's all it took. One corrupt FBI agent making one phone call, and America's most dangerous crime boss vanished into the night. According to federal sources, Bulger's FBI handler, longtime friend Special Agent John Connolly, tipped Bulger off to the 1995 indictment, allowing the criminal to flee with his girlfriend, Terrorize Stanley. The phone rang at Terrorize Stanley's house on that December evening in 1994, and with it, 16 years of running began. But here's something most people don't know. Whitey Bulger almost didn't make it out of Boston. He initially fled with Terrorize Stanley, his girlfriend of 30 years, but she couldn't handle life on the run. After just a few weeks, homesick and miserable, she begged him to take her home. This moment reveals something crucial about Bulger's character. He could have forced her to stay, could have threatened her, but he didn't. He drove her back to Boston, dropped her off, and picked up another woman, Catherine Gregg, a dental hygienist who had been his girlfriend on the side for years. Then he vanished again, this time for good. Catherine Gregg wasn't just another girlfriend. She was educated, disciplined, and completely devoted to Bulger. She had worked as a dental hygienist at a Boston area dentist for over 20 years. She was well regarded, responsible, and by all accounts, a normal person who had fallen under the spell of one of America's most dangerous men. She would give up everything, her career, her family, her identity, to spend the next 16 years hiding with a killer. The FBI's manhunt began immediately, but it was compromised from the start. How do you catch someone when the people supposed to be catching him have been helping him for decades? Much of the initial intelligence about Bulger's whereabouts and methods was tainted by the very corruption that had protected him. The Boston FBI office was in chaos, with agents turning on each other, some suspected of still protecting Bulger even after he fled. In 1995, Bulger and Flemmi were indicted on racketeering charges, and a sprawling case was developed against them. It was masterminded by Fred Wishak, a federal prosecutor who was brought in from New Jersey to be part of a Justice Department effort to address the FBI's Boston office. Flemmi was arrested, but Bulger was nowhere to be found. For the first few years, there were sightings everywhere. London, Ireland, Canada, Mexico, every few months, someone swore they saw Whitey Bulger. The FBI spent millions chasing ghosts. In 1997, shortly after the Boston Globe disclosed that Bulger and Flemmi had been informants, the FBI issued its first-ever press release acknowledging the embarrassing relationship and vowing to apprehend them. By then, the Bureau's reputation had been shredded. Meanwhile, Bulger was living quietly, moving from place to place, using fake identities he had been preparing for years. The FBI later discovered he had been obtaining false identification for years: driver's licenses, passports, social security cards. He had safe deposit boxes filled with cash scattered across the country and internationally. Some estimates suggest he had hidden away more than $40 million over his criminal career. In 1999, Connolly was arrested and charged with alerting Bulger and Flemmi to investigations, falsifying FBI reports to cover their crimes, and accepting bribes. The man who had created this monster was finally facing justice, but the monster himself was still free. The year 2000 brought a grim milestone. On May 2, 2000, Bulger became the 458th person added to the FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. The Bureau offered a $1 million reward for information leading to his capture. Later, the reward was increased to $2 million, making Bulger the second most wanted man in America after Osama bin Laden. Think about that transformation. The same agency that had protected him, that had helped him murder his enemies, was now offering $2 million for his capture. It was the ultimate irony, or perhaps the ultimate hypocrisy. The FBI needed to catch Bulger not just because he was a criminal, but because his continued freedom was a daily reminder of their corruption. Back in Boston, the trials continued without him. One of the most pathetic figures to emerge from the scandal was John Morris, Connolly's supervisor. Morris ultimately confessed to accepting $7,000 from Bulger and Flemmi, admitting that the first payment in 1982 left him feeling ashamed. He testified with immunity in a series of trials that led to the convictions of Connolly and others, portraying himself as a victim of Bulger's manipulation rather than an active participant in the corruption. Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's longtime partner, cut a deal. In 2003, Flemmi pleaded guilty to 10 murders and received a life sentence plus 30 years. During his testimony, he revealed the full extent of the FBI's protection, describing how they had been warned about investigations, helped to identify other informants who were then murdered, and even provided with information about their rivals' criminal activities. The most shocking revelation came when Flemmi testified about the murders of Deborah Hussey and Deborah Davis. Hussey was Flemmi's stepdaughter. Davis was his girlfriend. Both were strangled in houses in South Boston, their bodies hidden for years. Flemmi claimed Bulger did the actual killing, while admitting he helped dispose of the bodies. The brutality was staggering. These weren't just criminal rivals, but women who had been intimate with these men. In 2002, Connolly was convicted of racketeering conspiracy, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, but that wasn't the end for Connolly. In 2005, he was indicted for the 1982 murder of John Callahan in Florida. Because Florida has the death penalty for first-degree murder, Connolly was facing execution for his role in protecting Bulger. While all this was happening, Bulger was living in apartment 303 at the Princess Eugenia complex in Santa Monica, California. He and Catherine Gregg had been there since 1996, living as Charlie and Carol Gasco, a retired couple from Chicago. Their neighbors thought they were lovely, quiet, polite, keeping to themselves. Carol would sometimes mention having a daughter who was a doctor. Charlie would talk about his years working in Chicago. It was all fiction. The apartment was modest, a two-bedroom unit with a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Rent was $1,165 a month, paid in cash. Inside, the FBI would later find a very different picture. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing dozens of books about organized crime, the Mafia, and murder. There were multiple firearms hidden throughout the apartment, including a .357 Magnum revolver, a 9 pistol, and a 12-gauge shotgun. They found $822,000 in cash hidden in the walls. Bulger maintained his physical fitness even in his 70s and 80s, walking daily along the 3rd Street Promenade and the Santa Monica Pier. He was friendly with the neighbors but never intimate. He helped elderly residents with their groceries, fed a stray cat he named Tiger, and generally played the role of a harmless retiree. One neighbor later said she thought he was a lovely old man. But there were signs something was off. Charlie Gasco paid for everything in cash. He had no credit cards, no bank accounts, no phone in his name. When neighbors asked about his past, he would give vague answers or change the subject. He claimed to have emphysema but was never seen with oxygen or medication. He said he was from Chicago but couldn't name Chicago neighborhoods when pressed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 2010, the FBI began running public service announcements focused not on Bulger, but on Catherine Gregg. The theory was that Gregg might be easier to identify. She was younger, more likely to seek medical or cosmetic procedures, more likely to maintain contact with friends or family. The ads highlighted her love of animals, her dental hygiene background, and her distinctive appearance. On June 20, 2011, Anna Bjornsdottir, a former Miss Iceland 1974 in U.S. television actress, was watching television in Reykjavik when she saw the FBI's public service announcement about Gregg. She recognized the woman as her former neighbor in Santa Monica. Bjornsdottir had lived in the same building as Charlie and Carol Gasco and had even been inside their apartment. Bjornsdottir called the tip line. She told the FBI about the couple in apartment 303, about how they paid cash for everything, about how secretive they were. Within hours, the FBI was mobilizing, but they had to be careful. They'd had false sightings before, and if this really was Bulger, one mistake could send him running again. On June 22, 2011, the FBI set up a ruse. They called Bulger claiming to be from the building management, saying his storage locker had been broken into. When Bulger came down to check, federal agents were waiting. At 5:45 p.m., after 16 years on the run, James Whitey Bulger was arrested without incident. He was 81 years old. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. No shootout, no dramatic chase, just an old man in a baseball cap and windbreaker, looking confused as agents surrounded him. When they asked him to confirm his identity, he simply said, "You know who I am." Inside the apartment, agents found the extent of Bulger's preparation for life as a fugitive. Besides the cash and weapons, there were dozens of fake IDs, medical supplies, and disguises, including several sets of clothing and multiple pairs of glasses. There was also a copy of The Brotherhood of the Rose, a novel about 2 orphans trained as assassins who are betrayed by their handler, perhaps Bulger's commentary on his relationship with the FBI. Catherine Gregg was arrested alongside Bulger. She would later plead guilty to conspiracy to harbor a fugitive and identity fraud, receiving 8 years in prison. In 2016, she was given an additional 21 months for refusing to testify about who had helped them while they were fugitives. She remained loyal to the end, never revealing who might have assisted them during their years on the run. Bulger's trial began on June 12, 2013. The trial began on June 12, 2013, with the families of Bulger's victims filling out the gallery. He was tried on 32 counts of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and weapons charges, including complicity in 19 murders. For 7 weeks, the courtroom became a stage for one of the most dramatic trials in American history. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, including Bulger's former associates who had turned state's evidence. Among the dozens of witnesses were Bulger's accomplices, including hitman John Martorano, enforcer Kevin Weeks, and close associate Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy. Martorano testified about the 20 murders that he committed on behalf of his boss. The testimony was devastating. These were men who had killed with Bulger, who had shared in his profits, and now they were telling everything. The most dramatic testimony came from Stephen Flemmy. On the stand, Flemmy claimed that he personally watched his partner strangle to death Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. This was Bulger's longtime partner, describing in detail how they had murdered women who trusted them. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of victims' families. Bulger's defense team had a strange strategy. Bulger's defense attorneys did not deny that their client was a prolific racketeer, but they had two main points of contention. Bulger was not an FBI informant, and he was not a killer, particularly regarding the two murdered women, Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. Think about that. His main defense wasn't that he was innocent, but that he wasn't a rat. In the twisted logic of the criminal world, being a killer was better than being an informant, but Bulger's biggest claim never made it to the jury. He insisted he had been given immunity for his crimes by federal prosecutor Jeremiah O'Sullivan in exchange for protecting O'Sullivan from assassination attempts. According to Bulger, O'Sullivan asked the mobster to protect him from assassins in exchange for full immunity over past and future crimes. Judge Casper ruled that the defense would not be permitted to make that argument. When it became clear he wouldn't be allowed to present his immunity defense, Bulger made his feelings known. In the defendant's only verbal statement to the court, he said regarding the immunity claim denial, "As far as I'm concerned, I didn't get a fair trial, and this is a sham, so do what yous want with me." Bulger chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that spoke volumes. The man who had manipulated the FBI for decades, who had talked his way out of countless situations, suddenly had nothing to say when it mattered most. After closing arguments concluded on August 5, the jury deliberated for 5 days. When they emerged, Bulger was found guilty on 31 counts, including 11 of the 19 murder charges. With this verdict, the jury has found that Bulger played a role in the murders of Deborah Hussey, Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Arthur Barrett, and John McIntyre. The families of the victims had mixed reactions. Some felt vindicated after decades of waiting for justice. Others were devastated that their loved ones' murders weren't proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Patricia Donahue, widow of Bulger victim Michael, said she was happy with the verdict but felt sympathy for other victims' families. "I think there was justice today for me, maybe not for some other victims," she told reporters outside the courthouse. On November 14, 2013, Bulger was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment, plus 5 years. Casper told Bulger that such a sentence was necessary given his unfathomable crimes, some of which inflicted agonizing suffering on his victims. He was also ordered to forfeit $25.2 million and pay $19.5 million in restitution. Bulger showed no emotion during sentencing. The man who had terrorized Boston for decades, who had corrupted the FBI, who had murdered with impunity, sat silent as his fate was sealed. He would die in prison, but the story wasn't over yet. John Connolly's fate was also sealed by his association with Bulger. In 2002, he had been convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But in 2009, he was convicted of second-degree murder with a firearm in Florida for his role in the John Callahan murder, adding 40 years to his sentence. The FBI agent who had created this monster would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Meanwhile, William Bulger, Whitey's brother, saw his own career destroyed by association. Although never charged with any crime related to his brother's activities, he was forced to resign as president of the University of Massachusetts in 2003 after refusing to testify about whether he had been in contact with Whitey while he was a fugitive. The most powerful politician in Massachusetts was brought down by his brother's crimes. For 5 years, Bulger served his life sentence in various federal facilities. Bulger was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary Coleman II in Sumterville, Florida. Bulger was transferred to several facilities in October 2018, first to the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma and then to the United States Penitentiary, Hazleton, near Bruceton Mills, West Virginia. USB Hazleton was known as one of the most dangerous federal prisons in America. It was understaffed, violent, and housed numerous organized crime figures. Sending an 89-year-old former FBI informant, there was essentially a death sentence, and everyone knew it. On October 30, 2018, less than 24 hours after arriving at Hazleton, Bulger, who was in a wheelchair, was beaten to death by inmates on October 30, 2018, within hours of his arrival at Hazleton. The murder was brutal and symbolic. According to reports, his attackers attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue, traditional mob punishment for informants. The men responsible for Bulger's murder were quickly identified, though justice would take years. In 2022, Fodio's Gesh, Paul DeCollegiero, and Sean McKinnon were charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in Bulger's death. Fodio's Freddie Gesh, a Western Massachusetts-based hitman for the Genovese crime family, was the primary suspect in orchestrating the killing of Bulger. Gesh, 51, and his brother were sentenced to life in prison in 2011 for their roles in several violent crimes, including the 2003 killing of Adolfo Big Al Bruno, a Genovese family capo who was shot in a Springfield, Massachusetts parking lot. The murder was planned and brutal. Gesh, a one-time Mafia hitman, and DeCollegiero, a Massachusetts gangster, were accused of repeatedly hitting Bulger in the head while McKinnon served as a lookout. DeCollegiero told an inmate witness that Bulger was a snitch and that as soon as he came into their unit, they planned to kill him. DeCollegiero also told an inmate that he and Gesh used a belt with a lock attached to it to bludgeon Bulger to death, prosecutors said. What made the murder particularly shocking was that everyone seemed to know it was coming, except the Bureau of Prisons officials responsible for keeping Bulger alive. Sean McKinnon, speaking in a jailhouse interview, said word of Whitey Bulger gangsters transferred to their prison had spread well before his arrival. The entire prison knew that one of America's most notorious informants was being placed in general population with convicted mafia killers who despised rats. At 8:20 a.m. On October 30, the 89-year-old Bulger was found dead. Bulger was in a wheelchair and had been beaten to death by multiple inmates armed with a sock-wrapped padlock and a shiv. His eyes had nearly been gouged out and his tongue almost cut off. A law enforcement official described Bulger as unrecognizable. This was the third homicide at the prison in a 40-day span. The brutality of the murder sent a message that echoed through every prison in America. This is what happens to informants, even famous ones, even elderly ones in wheelchairs. The man who had used information as a weapon for decades had finally been killed for being exactly what he always denied being, a rat. Bulger's death was the result of multiple layers of management failures, widespread incompetence, and flawed policies at the Bureau of Prisons, the U.S. Justice Department's watchdog found in a 2022 report. The Inspector General found no evidence of malicious intent by any Bureau employees, but said a series of bureaucratic blunders left Bulger at the mercy of rival gangsters. Before we continue, a quick clarification. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. It does not promote or glorify crime, violence, or illegal behavior. All events discussed are based on publicly available information and are presented to highlight their consequences. Viewer discretion is advised. The killers eventually faced justice, though not as severe as their crime might warrant. On 6 September 2024, Fodio's Gesh was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for voluntary manslaughter in Bulger's killing. Since he was already serving life, the additional time was largely symbolic. Another Hazleton prisoner, Massachusetts gangster Paul J. DeCollegiero, was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison in August on an assault charge in Bulger's killing. Prosecutors said he acted as a lookout for Gesh. A third inmate, Sean McKinnon, pleaded guilty in June to lying to FBI special agents. McKinnon was given no additional prison time and was returned to Florida to finish his supervised release. The aftermath of Bulger's death revealed the full scope of the FBI's corruption scandal. Dozens of convictions had to be reviewed. Millions of dollars were paid out in settlements to families of victims who might have lived if the FBI hadn't protected Bulger. The agency's reputation was permanently tarnished, particularly in Boston, where trust in federal law enforcement may never fully recover. John Connolly remains in prison, serving his 40-year sentence for second-degree murder. The agent who thought he was playing Bulger was revealed as the one being played all along. He gave up everything, his career, his freedom, his honor, for a criminal who saw him as nothing more than a tool. Stephen Flemmi continues to serve his life sentence, having outlived his former partner. He occasionally gives interviews, each time revealing new details about their crimes, as if trying to shift more blame onto the dead man who can no longer defend himself. Catherine Gregg was released from federal prison in 2020, having served 8 years for helping Bulger evade capture. She has never spoken publicly about their years on the run, maintaining her silence even after his death. In some ways, she may have been the only person who ever truly knew James Bulger, not Whitey the crime boss, but Jimmy, the man she loved enough to give up everything for. William Bulger, the brother who took the legitimate path, died peacefully in 2023, having outlived his infamous sibling by 5 years. He never spoke publicly about Whitey after his capture, taking whatever secrets he had about their relationship to his grave. But the real tragedy of this story isn't just about the Bulger brothers or the corrupt FBI agents. It's about the victims, 19 confirmed murders, though the real number is likely much higher. Each victim had a family, had dreams, had a life cut short by a man who should have been in prison decades earlier. There's Michael Donahue, the innocent man who was just giving someone a ride home. There's Deborah Hussey, strangled by men she trusted, her body hidden for years. There's Roger Wheeler, the legitimate businessman killed for discovering he was being robbed. There's John Callahan, shot in the head and left in an airport parking garage. Each name represents not just a murder, but a family destroyed, children left fatherless, parents burying their children. The neighborhoods Bulger claimed to protect were devastated by his crimes. South Boston, which he said he kept safe from drugs, was flooded with narcotics that destroyed generations of families. The very people who looked up to him as a Robin Hood figure were his victims, paying him protection money, losing their children to the drugs he allowed to flow through their streets. The corruption that protected Bulger extended beyond just a few bad agents. It revealed systemic failures in how the FBI handled informants, how they prioritized cases, how they allowed the ends to justify increasingly criminal means. The top echelon informant program, which was supposed to help fight organized crime, instead became a tool that organized crime used to eliminate competition and operate with immunity. This story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice and law enforcement. How many criminals are walking free right now because they're providing information to law enforcement? How many murders could be prevented if agencies prioritized protecting citizens over making cases? How many John Connellys are out there right now, convinced they're the ones in control while being manipulated by the criminals they're supposed to be handling? The tragedy is that everyone involved had choices. Bulger could have gone straight after prison. Connelly could have arrested Bulger instead of protecting him. The FBI supervisors could have shut down the corrupt relationship. The federal prosecutors could have insisted on charging Bulger despite FBI protests. At every level, people chose to look the other way, to prioritize their careers or their agency's reputation over doing what was right. Even the final chapter of Bulger's life, his years as a fugitive, reveals the depth of the corruption. He lived openly in Santa Monica for 16 years, using identification that someone had to have helped him obtain, accessing money that someone had to have helped him hide. The FBI's inability to find him for so long raises questions about whether everyone really wanted him found, or if his capture would reveal truths that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. The murder of Whitey Bulger in prison wasn't justice, it was revenge. Real justice would have been Bulger facing trial decades earlier, before 19 people were dead. Real justice would have been John Connelly and his supervisors stopping the relationship before it became corrupt. Real justice would have been protecting the innocent people of South Boston from both organized crime and the law enforcement that enabled it. In the end, the story of Whitey Bulger is a cautionary tale about what happens when law enforcement loses its way, when the mission to fight crime becomes an excuse for committing crimes. It's about how power corrupts, how small compromises lead to enormous betrayals, and how the victims are always the innocent people caught in between. The FBI wanted to use Whitey Bulger to destroy the Italian Mafia in Boston. Instead, Bulger used the FBI to become the most powerful criminal in New England. He turned America's premier law enforcement agency into his personal weapon, wielding it against his enemies while building a criminal empire that destroyed countless lives. James Whitey Bulger died as he lived violently, surrounded by criminals, betrayed by those he thought he could trust. But his true legacy isn't his death or even his crimes. It's the permanent scar he left on American law enforcement, the proof that with enough cunning, enough ruthlessness, and enough willing accomplices in positions of power, a single criminal can corrupt an entire system. The mothers who lost sons, the wives who lost husbands, the children who lost fathers, they're the ones who paid the real price for the FBI's deal with the devil. Their pain didn't end with Bulger's death. It continues every day, in every empty chair at family dinners, in every milestone celebrated without loved ones, in every memory of what was, an imagination of what might have been. South Boston has recovered somewhat from the Bulger years. The old housing projects where he grew up have been redeveloped, the neighborhoods have gentrified, but ask anyone who lived through those times and they'll tell you the scars remain. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The belief that law enforcement is there to protect you, once shattered, is almost impossible to restore. The FBI has implemented numerous reforms since the Bulger scandal. The informant guidelines have been rewritten. The oversight has been increased, the culture, they say, has changed. But the fundamental tension remains. Law enforcement needs informants to fight crime, and informants are, by definition, criminals. The line between using them and being used by them remains perilously thin. As we look back on this story, one image stands out above all others. An elderly man in a wheelchair, beaten to death in a prison cell, his eyes gouged out, his tongue nearly severed. It's a brutal image, a shocking image, but perhaps the most shocking thing about it is that everyone saw it coming, everyone except the people whose job it was to prevent it. Whitey Bulger spent his life manipulating the system, convincing people he was something he wasn't, using violence and information as tools of power. He convinced criminals he was loyal while informing on them. He convinced the FBI he was valuable while using them. He convinced South Boston he was their protector while destroying their community. He was, in every sense, a master manipulator. But in the end, alone in that prison cell, there was no one left to manipulate, no more cards to play, no more phone calls that could save him. The man who had spent decades avoiding the consequences of his actions finally faced them, not in a courtroom where he could speak, not in front of a judge who would follow the law, but in the violent world he had chosen to live in, by the rules he himself had lived by. The story of James Whitey Bulger and his manipulation of the FBI isn't just history, it's a warning. It reminds us that corruption doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures, but creeps in through small compromises. It shows us that evil often comes not from monsters, but from ordinary people making extraordinarily bad choices. And most importantly, it teaches us that when law enforcement forgets that its primary duty is to protect the innocent, everyone suffers. The families of Bulger's victims have tried to move on, but how do you move on from something like this? How do you accept that your loved one died not just because of a criminal, but because the people sworn to protect them chose not to? How do you trust a system that failed so spectacularly?